Welcome to our Wednesday Bible study here on March the 30th of 2022. We're so glad you're tuning in. Unfortunately, we had missed last week's edition of the Wednesday Bible study. We had circumstances here in the congregation that demanded my presence with the family as they were going through a very difficult time and continue to now. And so we were unable to get the recording done for last week, but we're going to pick up where we were 2 weeks ago, opening our Bibles to Matthew chapter 10. As you're opening there and you begin to recall our Wednesday Bible study, I want to invite you to come to our in-person Bible study every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock here at Union Hill, and then also our first day of the week worship services as we meet to fulfill the commands of God and worship unto Him, doing it the way that God has authorized in Scripture. And we want you to be a part of that and have that opportunity to worship God as God desires to be worshiped. Now, we're coming to the book of Matthew. And it's been a couple weeks since we have discussed it, so I want to refresh our memories just a little bit about where we've been and what we're doing. The first thing we want to remember is that Matthew had an intended purpose. And anytime we sit down to understand the Scriptures, we have to understand the interpretation is not ours to make. It is Matthew's to make, or whatever the writer of the particular book we're reading happened to be. Remember, these were communications to people in the first century. So when Matthew sits down to write, he is most likely writing to a predominant Jewish audience of the first century. Individuals who would have had some familiarity with the prophecies of the Old Testament. And of course, he stresses, even early on, we noted the stress on the fulfilled prophecies that we find in the person of Christ. But Matthew had an intended purpose in writing a communique to these first century Israelites or first century Jews. And so what we're trying to decipher is what Matthew intended to mean. And remember, he was writing so as to be understood, so he would have communicated it in a way that those to whom he was writing would have been able to easily understand. He's not writing to give you an opportunity to interpret it how you want. He's writing and expecting you to interpret it the way he intended it to be interpreted, or the way he meant it, and those people of that time would have understood it. So that's what we're trying to decipher. As we look to the overall purview of the book, we note that there is a pervading emphasis on Christ Jesus, or the anointed, the Messiah. And so we're looking in this heavily focused book on the King and his kingdom. And in those first 4 chapters of introduction, he introduced the subject matter by demonstrating the lineage of the King, by showing the fulfilled prophecies regarding the birth and early couple of years of the king's life. He talked about the announcer or the harbinger of the king. And then he also noted the beginnings of that king as he begins to assemble, even in chapter 4, his disciples, having gained a decisive victory over his adversary. And so the first 4 chapters were introductory. When chapter 5 opens up, you have 3 chapters in 5, 6, and 7 that will focus on the words of Jesus. And of course, we're answering that question there. What did he say? When you examine what he said and how he said it and how it was received even by those who heard it, that he spoke as one having authority, you recognize that his words meet with one who is preeminent, one who is to be king. And then, of course, as we have opened up in chapter 8 and 9, and now chapter 10 today, we're focused on what he did, because these chapters, especially 8 and 9, overwhelmingly focus on the miracles of Jesus. And we noted in previous videos, a couple of weeks ago, we finished the section that dealt with chapter 8 and chapter 9, and those 10 miracles that Matthew records. Of course, many others Jesus did, but Matthew selected those particular ones, and they were a variety of miracles, but they all demonstrated with them things that Jesus said, marvelous things that Jesus said in performing those miracles, Some of them focused on not just the power, but the marvelous things that were said about Jesus by those who observed or were the recipients of the miracle having been accomplished. And then, of course, ending it, we looked at areas in which Jesus has immense power, whether it be in the physical realm, the moral realm, the spiritual realm, and all of that pointing toward his power eternally. So we have those things that he did, and certainly the things that he himself did indicate his right to the throne, or his right to claim kingship, or to be designated the Christ of God. Chapter 10 is also in that section. So as we begin it, you may have already read the chapter, and you understand that through the chapter there's no mention of miracles that Jesus did. However, there is this note. He gave his disciples power. As we look to verse number 1 of chapter 10, he called his 12 disciples. We're going to talk about those individuals. He gave them power against unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. So we're still within that realm of the things that Jesus did. And this chapter focuses on Jesus not only performing miracles himself, but having the ability to distribute that power unto other people, particularly his 12 disciples that he hand-selected for the task, and gave them power to do those things as well. Thus, an inherent power within him, not only to do those things, but also to allow others in his name to do them. And that is a focus of chapter 10. But of course, with that being said, we also look to recognize, well, why did he do that? And so in this chapter, we're going to note, number 1, his calling of these 12 particular men. We're also going to note what we will call the limited commission. And the reason we call it the limited commission is going to focus on the limited scope of the audience. Jesus is going to restrict the audience that he is going to send these disciples unto. And so as you think about that, there's a limited nature of it. Then we're going to see in the third part of the chapter, the Great Commission and things attached to it. And the thing that is going to mark the distinction or the changing of the subject is going to be the persecution. So just a brief overview of chapter 10. He calls his apostles. He is going to instruct them, send them out in a limited commission, but he's also going to address the future work of the Great Commission. And I think you'll understand that as we go through it. The first part, dealing with the apostles being chosen and being sent, is verse 1 through 4. Verse 5 through 15 marks the limited commission. And then picking up with verse 16, when he will begin talking about persecutions that will be encountered, he is going to then focus from verse 16 through verse number 42 on the Great Commission. And so that is kind of a breakdown of chapter 10. Depending on time in this video, we want to focus first of all on the apostles, and then if time allows, we'll advance into the section regarding the limited commission, what he was sending these 12 out to do. But we don't want to overlook those first 4 verses because of their significance. And of course, the importance here of the whole chapter is that Jesus is the source of the miraculous power. Not only he did miracles, but he was the source of that power. Now, in verse 1 through 4, we have the calling of the 12. They're noted as 12 disciples. And these 12 then are going to be specifically named, and you're going to see the transfer of title from one word to the other, or office. We might refer to it that way. They're the transfer of the title or office that these men would hold to another title or office. So out of these masses of people, out of the number of individuals that were disciples, Mark chapter 3 does record the event of the calling, how Jesus prayed all night. It was a momentous decision. He was selecting 12 men that he was going to commission in a very specific way and for a specific purpose. We'll talk about the meaning of the term apostle in just a minute. But from all of his disciples, he is going to hand select, and call forth 12 particular men. And so the names of the 12 apostles are these in verse number 2. They had already been selected prior to this moment, or prior to the events of chapter 10, but he takes those 12. He calls them for a particular task, and he's going to send them out. So who are these men? Well, you'll notice here that they are named Simon, who is also called Peter. Now, another name you might find in Scripture is the name Cephas. So you have Simon, you have Peter, and you have Cephas, generally a reference used by the Apostle Paul when he writes of him. Then you have Andrew, who is his brother. And I want you to note the construction here of Matthew and the way that these men are called. Notice he says, these 12 apostles are these. First Simon and Andrew, and then you have a semicolon after the term brother. You have a listing by groups. Notice the word and connects two of these men together, and then there are two more connected together, and then two more. Mark is going to tell us that he sends them out 2 by 2. So does Luke in this Great Commission. And the way that he has them subdivided here, all 12 are listed, but they're in groups, a group of 6, or groups of 2, and there's 6 groups, I should say. So you have Peter and Andrew, and of course, in the Bible, Peter is very well known. A lot is known of him. Andrew is his brother. There's a limited amount of information about him, but with Peter, a lot of that we know about Peter, we would also then know about Andrew, as they were brothers and were fishermen. You have James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They're going to form a duo or a pair. And of course, listed first, we would suspect that Peter was older than Andrew and James was older than John. We do know that James is the one who would be beheaded in Acts chapter 12 and is not the one who wrote the book of James. That would have been the brother of Jesus, earthly brother of Jesus by the name James. James was the first of these apostles that would be martyred. Then we have Philip and Bartholomew. Now, just a note here, we do see Philip in the Scriptures, not to be confused with Philip the evangelist of Acts chapter 7 and 8. But this Philip is going to be first introduced in the comments of John chapter 1, and now here listed along with Bartholomew. And the name Bartholomew is a patronymic. Anytime you see that B-A-R at the beginning of the name, Bartholomew, that is a meaning son of. So he is the son of Ptolemy or Tholomew, and that wouldn't be his name necessarily. It would be like a nickname, son of Ptolemy or Bartholomew. So what would his name have been? It's very likely that the man we're looking at here is the one that John the Apostle refers to as Nathanael in John chapter 1. You see the closeness of relationship between Nathanael and Philip as they are paired together here. There was a closeness between Philip and Nathanael in John chapter 1. Nathanael fit the characteristics, as Jesus refers to him, as an Israelite indeed, or a true Israelite. Nathanael was a man who fit the description of an Israelite in every way, not just by the physical connection to Abraham as a descendant, but even in the spiritual characteristics, the mental characteristics, the social characteristics. Everything about Nathanael was definitive or defined what it was to be an Israelite in God's definition. And that begs a question even of us, as we're often looking for personal application. How do we take these things and apply them to ourselves? Well, if Bartholomew be Nathanael, and Nathanael is a man who Jesus describes as being a Israelite indeed, I wonder if Christ would say of you, or if he would say of me, that we were a Christian indeed, that we fit the name Christian in every way, in every possible form, from every possible facet? Would he say of you that you are truly a Christian in every sense of the term, a follower of Christ, one who is dedicated to the cause of Christ? Or would he say, nah, you're just a Christian in name only. You wear the name, but you really don't have the disposition. You really don't have the heart. You're really not focused on the things of Christ and his kingdom. Would he say of you that you are a Christian indeed? As he said of Nathanael, you are an Israelite indeed, fitting the very mold. Remember, Paul said in Romans chapter 12 that we were not to be conformed to the world. We're not to be fit into the world's mold to look like those of the world, but rather we are to be transformed. There is to be a distinction between the Christian and the world. And when those distinctions are intact, then, my friend, you are a Christian indeed. So would Christ say of you, you are a Christian indeed? Now, we go on and he says, James, the son of Alphaeus, and also Labius, whose surname is Thaddeus. This particular man, Thaddeus, is also referred to by the name Jude, but not to be confused with the brother of Jesus, who also wore that name and wrote that short epistle near the end of the New Testament, just before Revelation. But Labius, or Thaddeus, is the least known of all the apostles. Then we have Simon the Canaanite. And by the term Canaanite, I believe it's Luke who refers to him as the Zealot or Zealot. And the word Canaanite here could be, or probably even should have been, translated Zealot or Zealot. And the idea of that word is referring to the particular group of Jews, or the sect of the Jews to which Simon would have belonged. We often hear about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There was also the group known as the Essenes, but there's also this group known as the Zealots, or the Canaanites. And these particular individuals were more zealous from the standpoint of patriotism to the nation. They hearkened on to the words of Judas Maccabeus and him calling upon men to be zealous for Israel. And so this group was generally referred to in the sense of patriots, more so in a civil way than in a religious way. But nonetheless, they desired to recover the Jewish freedom, to reestablish Israel as a free nation. Remember, in the first century, in the days of Jesus, they were under bondage to Rome. They were serving and paying tribute and custom unto Rome, indicating that they were not free people in the national sense or in the scope of civil life. They were subservient to Rome. And a man like Simon here, who had been a part of this group of zealots or patriots, would have liked to reclaimed that secular freedom, that civil freedom that they would have enjoyed. And then, of course, there's Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, here is the one disciple that is singled out as the one who betrayed Jesus. And, of course, we know the history. Matthew is writing after the events have transpired. Matthew didn't know during the earthly ministry of Jesus, even at the time that the limited commission was given, that Judas was of such character. And so after the fact, he makes it clear this is the one who had betrayed Jesus. And the word Iscariot, or the name Iscariot, is not so much a last name. And none of these men are given last names. Even the name Jesus Christ is not the idea that Christ was his last name. That was more of a title or a designation, because the word Christ connected to the idea of Messiah or anointed, the king, or the one who was coming as king. And so Judas Iscariot. Iscariot's not the last name, but it actually is a meaning of man of Kiroth. And Kiroth was one of the uttermost cities of Judah over near Edom, toward the coast of Edom. So in the far eastern parts of Judah or Judea, you have this town called Kirioth, and Judas Iscariot is just saying that this is Judas of Kirioth, or a man of Kirioth. So it designates the town from which he came. But those are the 12 men that Jesus chose. Now, by way of a little thought and application to these men, and it may be that we need to connect some other passages to fully get the grasp of this. And so you might look at Mark chapter 3. You might even look into Luke chapter 6, verse 12 through 16, when these men were first called, and maybe some other passages relative to gathering information about these men. But I want to make a point here about the men that Jesus chose. And think about it in relation to the church. Like I said, we're generally looking for application. And I want you to think about these 12 men that Jesus chose to be his apostles. Now, with these men, and of course, I guess we better explain the word apostle real quickly too. There is a distinction between the word disciple and the word apostle. A lot of people could be disciples of Jesus, but only a handful could be apostles of Jesus. Now, the term apostle could be a general terminology, but as the Greek word that is used here, it was actually a rare word in the profane Greek, but yet had a specialized meaning here within the scriptures as Jesus used it. What the word apostle means, as he names these 12 apostles, or he selects these 12 men from among the disciples and gives them the office, the title, the work of apostles or apostleship. We need to understand that word. That word means one sent forth, very definitely one chosen and set for specific work, or sent for specific work. A disciple was simply one who was a student, a pupil, a follower of Jesus, one who would learn from Jesus and make application of his teaching. But this idea of apostle means that from those 12, or from that group of followers, that group of learners, that group who was hearing and applying the words of Jesus, which all of us need to do, he then chose 12 that he was going to send to do a specific task. And so the specific task of Matthew chapter 10 and verse 5 through 15 is going to be the limited commission, in which Luke would tell us he also sent 70 other people as well. But he sends the 12 in that. Then there's going to be an even more definite sending forth of the 12 apostles, in which they would be sent with a specific task of being witnesses of Christ. That's not a task you and I have been called to give or to do. That's not something that we have been obliged to fulfill. Remember, the qualifications of an apostle are given in Acts chapter 2, or Acts chapter 1 rather, when they were trying to fulfill or supply for the office that Judas had vacated. Remember, Judas went and hanged himself, and they needed to fulfill, or they needed to put another in his place, and that was a fulfillment of a prophecy from the book of Psalms. And so 2 qualifications. They had to have seen the Lord alive after his death. They also had to have been with the Lord throughout his earthly ministry. And so when you take those 2 qualifications, not one of us today would actually meet that definition of an apostle. Doesn't mean the church might not send you in a particular task, but you're not an apostle, and to wear that name is to demonstrate a lack of understanding in the gospel or a presumption. Because if the qualifications are you had to have seen Jesus alive after his resurrection, and you had to have walked with Jesus during his earthly ministry, then you are speaking as though you did that to call yourself an apostle of Jesus Christ. So these men were sent for a a specific task, and Jesus outlines that not just within this chapter, but throughout his work upon the earth. He is preparing the men for that task. And then, of course, in Acts chapter 2, they're going to commence that Great Commission, and they're going to commence that task of being witnesses in Jerusalem, then Judea, then unto Samaria, and then unto the uttermost part of the earth, Acts 1 and verse number 8. So now we understand the distinction of an apostle, and it's very important to understand that there are no living apostles today. If someone comes to you or comes to the congregation, the church that you are a member of, and they claim apostleship, and they claim the authority of an apostle, remember the words of Paul. Though we or an angel from heaven bring any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached, let him be accursed. Mark that individual as a false teacher, because they are not apostles, nor can they be by the scriptural definition. So, as we go on and think about these men, and we gather and kind of make a synopsis of the history of these men, here's 3 points that we can really settle on that I think present to you and I as a part of the church a sublime lesson. Number 1, these 12 men, some of them were well known and some of them were obscure. You remember I mentioned with the first name Peter that we know a lot about him. But then we mentioned Thaddeus, who is also called Labius or Jude, and I said he is the least known of all the apostles. There is little information about that man. And somewhere in between all the others fit. Some of these men were well known, some of them were obscure. They were all Galileans, and that was, to the outside world, to the world at large, and even within the Jewish communities, that would be to consider them generally rude or unlettered or unpolished, not the elite of the day. They weren't real rich, but they weren't real poor. Wealth and social position doesn't matter in the Lord's church. It's not a prerequisite to serving the Lord. You don't have to be a wealthy individual to be worthy of service unto the Lord, and you don't have to be a poor man in order to be of service unto the Lord. And these men, as we think about them, they're not real rich, they're not real poor, but they were fit for service. Are you fit for service? No matter what your economic standing is. They weren't real educated, but they weren't ignorant men either. They were just plain men. They were your average, ordinary Joes, if you will. But the real knowledge that they had was of Jesus the Christ. Men can gain all the knowledge that this world can supply them. Man can be provided with education upon education upon education and have multiple degrees behind their name. But if they don't know Jesus, if they're not educated in Jesus, they're not fit for service under the Most High God. What about you? Do you know about Jesus? These men were religiously sincere men. They did what Jesus desired of them. Now, they weren't perfect men. We read about problems that Peter had both during the earthly ministry of Jesus and even an occasion after the church had begun. Paul talked about it in Galatians chapter 2. These aren't perfect men. However, they were fit for service because while not being perfect men, they were honest and sincere men, and men ready to make the changes necessary and conform to the will of God in order to be fit for service. So on the first significant point about all of these men, some of them were obscure, some of them were well known. Even John was known of the high priest and was able to go in that night that Jesus faced those trials and prior to his crucifixion when those Jewish leaders turned him over to Pilate to be crucified. Some were obscure, some were well known, but they were all fit for service. Not because they were well known, not because they were obscure, not because of riches or poverty, not because of education or lack thereof, not because of religious renown, but because of religious sincerity and an honesty and willingness to follow Jesus. That evidences that the true nature of Christianity and the true center of Christianity is Christ. That's what made these men so powerful. That's what made these men so great, was their focus on Jesus. Their work was to preach Christ and not themselves. These men, as some were obscure, some were well known, and all of their statuses were different. These were men who focused the world to Jesus. Even in this limited commission, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then after that, they would point men to Jesus as witnesses of Christ. Paul said that he preached Christ, not himself. Think about the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Even with their work, we don't know of work that Thaddeus did. We don't know what James the Less did. We don't know what Matthias did after he was added to take Judas's place. Now, we know a lot about what Peter did, and we know a lot about what John did because we have record of that in Scripture. Often as those two work together, we know a lot about what Paul did, but we don't know a lot about what Andrew did. We know more about Philip the evangelist and his work in the kingdom than we know about Philip the apostle. But while that work may have been forgotten from the annals or records of earthly history, they haven't been forgotten with God. And those 12 men have gone on to their reward. Hebrews 6 and verse 10, that record is written. Number 2 about these men, something that we can focus on and learn, they were different. They were unique. None of these men were identical to any other man. Even within those that were brothers, Peter and Andrew, James and John. If you've been around siblings at all, you might have had a sibling or two, or 3 or 4, I don't know how many you might have had, but you know, just like I know, that even brothers and sisters, or brothers and brothers, sisters and sisters, these siblings can be so different. I have 2. I have 2 daughters, and while those daughters have similarities, and they have aspects about them that are like each other, some of that has to do with environment, some of it just has to do with physical, emotional, and mental makeup. But while there are things that are very similar, there's also things that are quite different. And even in raising them or rearing them, there was a distinctiveness between how each of them needed to be dealt with, talked to, handled, disciplined, and so forth. And so even within the ones that were brothers, like Peter and Andrew and James and John, there was still a great uniqueness to each of these. No 2 are just alike, and that's the case in the kingdom. That's the case with the church, that for which they were sent forth to proclaim. And so it is in the church. Everyone is different, but everyone has a place. And that was the emphasis of Romans chapter 5, or Romans chapter 12 rather, verse 4 and 5, or 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 12 through 27. Just the idea that the body is composed of many parts. The church has many members. We don't all have the same office. We don't all have the same responsibility, but we're all expected to fulfill the responsibility we have. Jesus chose 12 men, selected them to be his apostles, and they were unique, but every one of them filled the desired role that Jesus had in their apostleships. Number 3, they were the best material for the work to be done. They'd already passed the test, or they'd been tested already, we might say. John chapter 1 and 2, we note the time spent that Peter had with Jesus. We note Philip and Nathanael. They'd been called once to come and observed Jesus. They heard what John the Baptizer had to say, and they followed him. They passed a test. Well, then you understand that these men were called from everyday honest labor. We talked about this with chapter 4 when Peter and Andrew and James and John were first called. They were men engaged in honest and humble labor, and Jesus called them. And because they had been such in honest and humble labor, they were fit for work in the kingdom. And there's a lot of other things that we could address about them, but those are some real observable points about these 12 men. Number one, some were obscure and some were well known. Whatever the condition is that we find ourselves in, understand that really focuses us on knowing that the true center of Christianity is Christ. It's not you, it's not me, it's not some famous preacher, it's not some obscure member that no one knows about. The focus of Christianity is Christ. And these men demonstrate that. No two were just alike, but every one of them had a role to fulfill. No two members of the church are just alike, but every one of us within the house of God, within the family of God, within the church of Christ has a responsibility. And that responsibility is what we supply to the whole of the body. And number three, they were the best material for the work to be done. Jesus so selected them. He scrutinized in this matter. He scrutinized his disciples. He prayed about this matter in order to select the right 12 men. That begs a question. Would Christ choose you? When Christ scrutinizes your life, would he find in you the best material for the job? Have you so readied yourself, prepared yourself, and equipped yourself with the knowledge of God's word and the preparation from God's word to be a workman that needeth not be ashamed? Have you equipped yourself to every good work? 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15, and chapter 3 verse 16 and 17. These men were well equipped to that task. So these are the men that Jesus called. All right, let's move on to the second portion of this chapter. And this is where we focus on the limited commission. And I want you to notice within this limited commission, it's limited in the sense of the scope of its audience. I want you to notice here in verse number 5 and verse number 6. He says, "Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans. Enter ye not." There's a restriction. I'm sending you forth, but don't go here and don't go here. However, he says in verse 6, "But go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And so here is the limitation of this commission. God is sending them forth. They have a mission to perform. He is giving them a charge. He is lading them with responsibility. And this responsibility involves going to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So the audience in its scope is only those who are Israelites. That's the sense in which it's limited. And of course, the Great Commission was not so limited because he said, "Go into all the world, teach the gospel to every creature." Every single human being is considered under the Great Commission. But here, not the Gentiles, not the Samaritans, only the house of Israel. So that's the limitation of the scope. Now, where do we make the change, or how do we denote the point at which Jesus shifts from the limited commission to the Great Commission? Verse number 16, he says, "I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." Verse 17 explains why they need to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, because of men, or more literally wolves. They'll deliver you up. And he begins to talk about persecution. That notation of persecution marks the changing of the subject. And you might want to look at it from the standpoint of what Mark writes in Mark chapter 6, or what Luke writes in Luke chapter 9, and then into chapter 10, he sends forth the 70 in this commission. And so there is a known break. Persecution, as he describes it in the latter portion of chapter 10, does not fit with the structure of the limited commission and the events of the limited commission. Remember, the disciples came back amazed and rejoicing at the things that had been accomplished, and no mention of persecution. Yes, there may have been those who didn't receive them, and Jesus talked about that. If they don't receive you, shake the dust off your shoes. However, the persecution that he speaks of in being delivered to councils and being scourged in their synagogues, there was not one of these apostles or disciples that had been selected to be apostles sent in this limited commission to the house of Israel that are on record as having been scourged by any kind of council. But in Acts chapter 4 they were, Acts chapter 5 they were, when they were beaten and told no longer to preach in the name of Christ as they were fulfilling the Great Commission. He also says they'd be brought before governors and kings. No record in the limited commission of such an event where they were brought before governors and kings, nor to the extent of the inspired answering, because he says, take no thought in verse 19, because it would be given them. That inspiration didn't come till the Holy Spirit came in Acts chapter 2, and the Great Commission came into effect. So that mark of persecution is going to be the differentiating point at which Jesus leaves the discussion of the limited commission and goes into the discussion of the Great Commission. Well, let's think about this limited commission for just a moment. And it really has four parts to consider from verse number 5 to verse number 15. Of course, the subjects that we've already talked about. The lost sheep of the house of Israel are the subjects of this Great Commission. Who is it that these apostles are being sent to teach? Of course, we're dealing with those who are descendants of Abraham physically, part of the kingdom of Israel. Number 2, we have the message, and at the end of verse number 7, he tells them what to preach. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Remember, by the time the Great Commission is in effect, the kingdom has come. But now the kingdom is at hand. A fitting work to be done, because John the Baptizer had announced this. Jesus himself took up that message, and now he sends his disciples during his earthly ministry to advance that message as well. They're carrying out the message of Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Then he begins to talk about the accoutrements of this limited commission. And what we mean by that are actually the things that Jesus tells them to take, in part by virtue of the things he says don't take. He says in verse number 9, provide neither gold, nor silver, nor brass in your purses, nor scrip for your journey, neither two coats, neither shoes, nor yet stays, for the workman is worthy of his meat. The accoutrements. What do we take with us? Well, number 1, don't take gold, silver, and brass. And you see a descending order of value. Gold, silver, then brass. And he says even, or copper, as is the case, was not needed. Copper was just as unneeded as gold would be in this endeavor. So don't take that. There is going to be a dependency that is established upon the message that they are taking and the support for the bringing of that message and the preaching of that message that would come from it. So take no brass, no gold, silver, or brass, or copper. He says in your wallet or in your scrip. The word scrip is a word, or translated from a word, that means wallet. It was actually a small basket that would have been carried on the back, something like a backpack. I personally, a lot of times, carry my computer and books for study in a backpack instead of a briefcase. And in this case, the scrip was the wallet. It could be carried on the back or over the shoulder. The word purse here actually means pockets. And that was a reference to the girdle or the belt that would be used for carrying money. And so don't take that. Take no scrip. for your journey. Don't take the brass in your purses. And then he says, regarding coats, shoes, and staves, notice the plural here that is begun with two coats. Neither two coats, meaning you take the coat you have on, but you don't take an extra one. You don't take extra shoes. It's either Mark or Luke that actually says just the sandals on your feet. So you don't take an extra pair of shoes, and you don't take an extra stave or staff. God is going to provide these things as they're needed through those that are hearers of that message. And so he used the term, the workman is worthy of his hire. You're going out, you're going to, in essence, be working in the best interest of these individuals. And because you're working for them, they're going to provide support for you. The workman being worthy of his hire is certainly a matter of even New Testament teaching throughout. It's used regarding the preacher and the analogy of the Old Testament. Don't muzzle the mouth of the ox treading out the corn. Paul will use examples in 1 Corinthians 9 relative to a soldier who goes to war. He doesn't provide for his own. The people that he is fighting for make provision for him. The preacher is found within that, as Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 9, and being worthy of his hire. The elder of 1 Timothy 5:18, worthy of double honor that labors in the word. And the idea of honor there is payment or support. He's worthy of that. So that is a principle taught throughout the Bible, and Jesus addresses here. If you're going to go out and you're going to preach this spiritual message that is going to bring spiritual good to the people that hear and receive it, then by virtue of you supplying for their spiritual needs, they will in turn be God's hands or God's feet or God's supply for you in your physical needs. And so the workman is worthy of his hire. There was actually in the 2nd century, around 150 AD, maybe even as early as 100, a tract that was circulating among the churches. Marvin Vincent, in his word studies in the New Testament, addresses it. And there are actually statements of advice, you might say, given to those first century congregations regarding those who would come in among them and those who would journey, these missionaries and so forth that would come into their house or be supported. And he said they stay one night and then they're on their way. You support them. Maybe 2 nights if the circumstances are right, but if they stay 3 nights, they're a false teacher. And if they take anything more than just the necessities, then they're a false teacher. And just this whole catalog of things that they needed to be aware of or that they needed to consider relative to these traveling preachers, but nonetheless still teaching the workman worthy of his hire. Now, if you look in verse number 14, we have the solemn witness to the fact of acceptance and rejection. Whosoever shall receive you, verse number 14, whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words when you depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust of your feet. Now, this particular action was just a way of outwardly demonstrating that there had been a rejection of the message that had been brought forward. And it really comes from a Jewish cultural practice where they would, in returning from foreign lands, Gentile nations, they would, as they were about to enter into the promised land or back into the lands of Israel, they would take their shoes off and knock the dust off of them that had been picked up in those Gentile nations. And so now, as though they were unworthy. And so now, because that house had judged itself unworthy, shake the dust. Now, whether that was a literal thing that was done, and of course we would take it in a metaphorical or symbolic way of understanding, that your responsibility has been done. You have done what your responsibility was to do, and if they rejected, that's not on you. They are the ones who stand responsible for that. And that begs another question. As these disciples were called to be apostles, and they're given this responsibility, and they fulfill their responsibility, Jesus says, when you've done what was your responsibility to do, you're free from the blood of those people in the punishment that would be received. What about you and I? Have we fulfilled the responsibility that he has given to us in the teaching and preaching and the fulfilling of the Great Commission? Have we accomplished the responsibility that we have of personal Christianity, being a Christian in everyday life, in all of that which is commanded of us? Have we been responsible for that? That shaking of the dust indicated that those men had done what was theirs to do, and others just didn't follow it. What about you? Have you fulfilled your responsibility to Jesus? In verse 15, he says, for those that had rejected, it would be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. Jesus used this terminology in other places too. He pronounced a woe upon Capernaum and Bethsaida, places that he had walked profusely, places where he had been and they had seen the miracles, and yet Sodom and Gomorrah, Tyre and Sidon didn't see the things that those people saw. And so more tolerable for them, because to know and reject is far worse than to not know. And so what do you know about the gospel? Have you received it? Have you obeyed it? Have you been living faithfully to it? If not, it would be more tolerable for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah in judgment than even for you and I. That takes us up through verse number 15. I hope that our brief discussion today has been profitable for you. Hope that you're going to learn and be able to make application from the things that we've overviewed. Next video, perhaps next week, we will come back and we will look from verse 16 through the end of the chapter and discuss matters pertaining to the Great Commission portion of Matthew chapter 10.